y'all. I hope everything is going relatively well given our situation. So I thought I would offer this course on symbolic logic, kind of give you all something to do while we are in quarantine. I know that Father Brian, Monsignor, Father Gima, we're offering Mass for you all. We're still doing the daily sacrifice. So keep that in mind and know you're in our prayers. And if you need anything, just give us a call. So last time we mentioned that we would do a course on symbolic logic, which in many ways, logic itself is just the foundation of philosophy. In some ways, it is philosophy itself. And I propose symbolic logic to basically be the programming language of reality. It's turning language, it's turning thought into basically equations in order to determine the validity of a train of thought. The question might be asked, why should we have logic in the first place? You can get into conversations with radical skeptics who might say something like, the principle of identity doesn't apply, the principle of non-contradiction isn't true. There are several reasons why we might say that logic is very useful if you need any convincing. Rejecting logic is self-refuting. Now, why is this? Any time that you make an argument against logic, you're necessarily going to be using logic to try and refute logic. But if logic is refuted, then the very reasons that you gave in order to reject logic are rejected. So rejecting logic is a self-refuting endeavor. Also, you can see when people toy with rejecting it, they are never going to be consistent. If we imagine that we can live without logic, we can play around with that idea for a little bit of time, but to continue on with your life, you're necessarily going to embrace it wholeheartedly once more. You can never continually reject logic and live life. Likewise, all our actions are done with thought. But as we discussed earlier, logic is a name for the structure of thought. Now look at the epistemology class. You cannot have a thought which is illogical and which is an error. And if you want to go back and look at the epistemology class, it's recorded on there and you can see the arguments for that. But if you examine thought, you'll understand that error can never arise with thought itself because thought is inherently logical. Its very structure is logic. I'll give you an example of this. Think of the four-sided triangle. Well, the point is you can't think of the four-sided triangle. It is impossible. Anything that is contradictory by definition cannot be an object of thought. As again, thought itself is structured by logic, and without a structure, thought has nothing to exist upon. So, logic is needed for all action, since all action is done with thought. All conscious action, that is, at least. Likewise, communication is done with logic. Communication is nothing but the transfer of thought. Now, if thought is inherently logical, then no transferring of thought can be done when one rejects logic. Think of somebody who claims that you can say nothing true about reality. Somebody who denies the very ability of reason to identify anything. If they're communicating to that, they're communicating some reason and logic thereof. But this is impossible for one who has truly rejected the possibility of logic. So communication is impossible if one rejects logic. So we can look at reasons for rejecting logic in some, right? If you reject logic, you refute yourself, you never really fully do so, and you cannot act at all. You can't even communicate. Now remember the order of truth. There's various ways to get at truth. One of the primary ways in thought is through philosophy and logic. All other ordering of thought is contingent. It depends on this as a foundation. You cannot do math, you cannot do any of the sciences without first presupposing the authority of philosophy and logic. If, for instance, in the natural sciences, you presuppose something or come to some conclusion that is inherently illogical and contradictory, you undermine the very basis of the authority of those natural sciences. The same goes with mathematics, which is just logic applied to quantities. The natural sciences is logic applied to empirical data and hypotheses and testing that empirical data. So rejecting logic also means the rejecting of all ordered thinking. We should not. Now, in our context, in the Catholic context, it's important to look at what the Church says about this, because there's many misconceptions, there are many false ideas of the Church's relationship to reasoning and logic. There are many verses in the Scripture talking about wisdom, talking about the use of reason. One of the more important ones, or one of the more famous ones, I think, is 1 Peter 3:15. It says, "Always be ready to give an explanation to anyone who asks you for a reason for your hope." Now, interestingly enough, this word translated as explanation is the Greek word apologia. Apologia. Apo means from, and logia is basically the word logos, which can be translated as word, reason. It's similar to the word logic, too. There's not the current Greek word for the word logic, but it's where you get the derivative of the word logic. So always from reasoning, give an explanation, or always from reasoning, give a reason for the faith. And you can't do this, obviously, without the use of reason. There are many statements also in the Church's documents about the relationship between faith and reason. The Filius has a very high dogmatic or doctrinal status because of it being the Constitution of Vatican I. Now, this basically, in sum, will say that God, being truth, is the source of all particular truths. So the same God who reveals the faith, who reveals the mysteries of faith, is not going to contradict himself in the revelation of truth by the light of reason. In other words, faith and reason can never conflict. This is important to keep in mind because you'll sometimes hear people exaggerate what we mean by the mysteries, or exaggerate what we mean by revelation beyond reason. The Church doctrinally teaches that faith and reason will not conflict. And when somebody proposes that, they're proposing something against Church teaching. It's true that the Church will say things like there are aspects of revelation which have not been revealed by human reasoning alone, but not that those conflict with human reason. It is simply another source for truth, and sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, they will coincide. A mystery of faith sometimes can be found, or a doctrine of faith can sometimes be found through the light of reason, though sometimes with much greater effort. Also important to understand, one of the more famous documents on the relationship of faith and reason is Faith and Reason by St. John Paul II. And basically, it's important to keep in mind that these mutually support each other. Faith guides our reasoning, and reasoning guides our faith. And this can be said more than just in the Catholic doctrinal context. Many times you have to presuppose certain assumptions. In fact, you do have to presuppose certain assumptions to even use reason in the first place. But to get some of those presuppositions, you use reason to get to them. So they find themselves mutually supporting each other. And this happens also with the specifically Catholic doctrines as well. And it's important to keep them helping each other and not to exclude one for the other. When you find an error or an issue with reason with a doctrine, it's important to try and reconcile them because they can be reconciled. More importantly, I think, than all of these things is to understand what we are the religion of. We are the religion, particularly in context of John 1, of the Logos incarnate, the reason, the rationale, the Word incarnate. We aren't the religion of the pathos incarnate. We aren't the religion of the ethos incarnate. We're the religion of the Logos incarnate. Fundamentally, ours should be, therefore, a religion where reason reigns in a very high status, as we've in many ways come close to identifying it with the Son of God. So symbolic logic particularly. In this class, we are going to cover two things. And the hope of this is after today's class, you'll be able to translate into logic basic sentences of really any language. Of course, we're going to use English, but basically take any linguistic statement and be able to give a basic translation of at least parts of it. The second part of the class is we're going to turn arguments into equations to prove their validity. And this can be done. It's commonly not understood by society, as you can see in today's politics, perhaps, but you can actually take arguments and prove them to mathematical certainty, their validity. So, looking into translating logic. Important to note is that most languages come very close to being purely logical. But there's two issues, at least two issues that I've identified with languages, and other people do as well, is that they often will say too much, or they will in some ways not say enough, or they'll be ambiguous to where you don't exactly know for sure what is stated in the use of logical connectors. So for instance, saying too much. You can take this with grammatical rules that are purely grammatical. Now, many, in fact, perhaps most grammatical rules convey some logical relationship. But oftentimes there are grammatical rules that do not, that are purely grammatical. They purely work in the language context, but add nothing to a meaning. So for instance, one example that I can think of is conjugations in a lot of English verbs, right? So he runs versus I run. Now, if I were to say he run versus I run, well, the only reason that S is added is not for some logical addition, but simply a rule of grammar. The subject is already provided by how English needs to use it with the addition of he or the addition of I. The conjugation of runs or run really doesn't add anything except a grammatical rule that's internal to the English language. And this is just one example of some other things. Other things I can think of, I can think of in Spanish. One part of Spanish that definitely troubles me a lot is the subjunctive. The subjunctive is often a problem for me, and I find that the subjunctive is one that could be eliminated. It seems a lot of the use of the subjunctive is purely grammatical. You can convey the same meaning with an additional word without all the additional rules required by the subjunctive. Lack of precision is another issue with languages. So for instance, I might say I run or talk. That can mean two different things. It can mean strictly this logically, I run or talk, and if I run and talk, this would also be true. But many times when I say something like this, I mean something mutually exclusive. I mean something like either I run or I talk, but not both. Now this statement probably conveys either or, ironically, or fittingly. It conveys either I run or talk, or I run or talk, but not both. So it will lack precision. Language often lacks this precision and conveys a certain sense of ambiguity. And because of that ambiguity, interpretations into logic are sometimes that, interpretations. You don't know for sure without further clarification which I'll add logic will provide you with, you don't know until further clarification what exactly is meant between the ambiguities there. So these are the basic symbols for translating into symbolic logic. Well, there's just some of them. There are further symbols, existential quantifiers, and things like that, but that's more advanced logic, which we will not cover today. But these are some basic symbols of translating into logic. Now, the handout that I sent you through the email, there's a handout, a symbol key. It has a symbol key, it has the logical rules of inference, and it has the logical equations, you might say, or logical equivalencies. And you can refer to that sheet throughout this presentation. Remember, obviously, you can pause this presentation at any time. If anything's not clear, you can also go back. But take a look at that symbol key because it'll be useful when we start translating sentences. But let's go over the meaning of each of these symbols. So first of all, A, B, C, D, E, whatever variable you want to use, a alphabetical letter is a pretty easy way of doing it, but it simply fills in for some meaning. So for instance, C can fill in for the word coffee. R could fill in for the word it's raining. It's just a shorthand way of symbolizing a short statement or a word. Pretty self-explanatory, I think. The next one is negation. And I forget what this symbol is exactly. I think it's called a tilde. But this represents, and in most logical languages that are out there, they'll use the same symbol. Sometimes you'll see, I believe, something that looks a little bit like this, meaning the same thing. But it means not, or it means negated. So when you have something like this, not a, or negation a means not a. So when you deny a, this is how you symbolize it. Now you can use as many tildes as you need, and each one represents a single negation, or a single not. So double tilde a would mean not a. So, for instance, let's say you said, I don't not have apples. Not a typical use of grammar in the English language, though you'll see double negation used a bit more in other languages. But not a, or not, I don't have an apple, or I don't not have an apple could be symbolized potentially by that, or that there's not an apple, perhaps a better way would be symbolized perhaps by something like this. Now, as you might have gathered, the use of these letters is kind of subjective. You just clarify what that represents when you use that word. But coffee doesn't need to be used by a C. It's the most convenient way to symbolize that. I guess if you really wanted to, you could symbolize it by that or an E, but yeah, it makes it easier when you just refer to the first letter there, or the main subject there. So a ampersand, a conjunction. This is a symbol we'll use for a conjunction. Another symbol you might see is simply a dot, right? Sometimes you'll see a plus sign. There's not a governing body of specific grammatical language for symbolic logic, but it's relatively close. So the symbols used are relatively close. But it's a conjunction, and we're going to use the ampersand for it, and it means and. The conjunction means and. It can also mean but, actually. But is a conjunction, and you can use that as well. Now, sometimes when you use the word but, you mean it to the exclusion of the thing that precedes it, but not always. So it is useful to remember that that's how you would symbolize that. Any conjunction, anything that basically carries this meaning and is conveyed by the symbol of the ampersand. So for instance, if you said something like apples and berries, you might symbolize it like this, A and B. That is what that means. The next symbol is a disjunction. It is an or statement. It is symbolized by a V. Now, an or statement is that either A or B is the case. Now, note what I just said. Either A or B is the case. I didn't say not both but simply either or, because they could both be the case, and that could still be true. A V simply symbolizes the disjunct, the or. We don't know if we have both or simply one of them. So that's how we symbolize that. A conditional statement, we might call this a one-way conditional statement because we have what's called a biconditional statement. A conditional statement is an if-then statement. So let's say if I have apples, then I have berries. I might symbolize it like this: if A, then B. What's important to understand about a conditional statement, and one thing that definitely distinguishes it from these, is that a conditional statement doesn't actually posit that there is an A or a B given. Simply that if there were an A, then there would be a B, but not that there actually is an A. So remember, it's conditional. It's conditional. When you posit in a conjunction, you're positing that there is A and B. Not if there is A and B, but simply that there is A and B. Likewise, in a disjunction, you're positing there is A or B. But in a conditional, you aren't positing that. You're only positing if there were, then B follows. So finally is the biconditional statement. You can kind of look at it as this, right? It's a conditional statement in both directions. So both directions, right? A then B doesn't imply B then A. A then B does not imply B then A. I'll give you a perfect example of this. Let's say D then M, where D represents dog and M represents mammal. Now, if you have a dog, you'll have a mammal, but that does not imply that if you have a mammal, then you'll have a dog. There are many different mammals that are not dogs. So a one-way conditional statement doesn't imply the reverse. A biconditional does. A biconditional means that if you have A then B, you also, you also, and, my ampersand there, it's hard writing in this. You'll also have that. It's a both-way conditional statement. So when you have equivalency, you'll have something like this. So let's say my name were John, right? If I say I am John, I would translate it with this. But if I said I am a human, I would translate it like this. Because whenever you have that John, you also have me. But when you have a human, you don't necessarily have me. It's a one-way. So a biconditional equivalency means if and only if. That's another way to translate an English statement into it. If and only if. Again, this means if A then B and if B then A. So biconditional statement. So before we move on, let's look at when these statements are true and when these statements are false. And some things I think you sometimes find tricky are these two because of the ambiguity of the English language. And this ambiguity I think follows in most other languages as well, but definitely applies to the English language. These can be tricky symbols immediately for the first time user of symbolic logic in English. So first look at A, B, C, D, and E. Those are always going to be true when they're true. Simple as that. If A is A, then A. Yeah, so not too complicated there. So let's look at the first modifier of one of these symbols, right? So when you have a negation, take for example that not A. Not A is only going to be true when A is false. So if A is false, then the negation of A is true. Take this for example, double negation. You can even talk about triple negation in other instances, but you'll see the logic, I think, when we apply it to double negation. Double negation is going to be true when A is true, and only when A is true, because it's a negation of a negation. So it reverses the value there. So if A is true, then this whole statement is true. But if A is false, that whole statement is false. Likewise, going back here, if A is true, then this statement is false. The negation of A is false. So let's look at the conjunction. A and B. A and B is only going to be true when both A and B are true. If either A or B is false, or both of them are false, then A and B is false. So A and B is only true when they're both true. And you can further apply to start getting into the more complicated stuff. When you have a negation of both, what do you think is going to be the case here? When is this going to be true? It's only going to be true when both A and B are false. But if A and B are true, if either one are true or both are true, then it is false. Now, disjunct is where we sometimes will mess up here. Because a disjunct, I think, first of all, you'll be able to tell, obviously, a disjunct is true when one of them are true. If A is true or B is true, then the whole disjunct is true. So if B is false but A is true, then the disjunct is true. If A is false and B is true, then the disjunct is true. And obviously, if both of these are false, then the disjunct would be false because it wouldn't be A or B. It would be neither. But here's the part where sometimes I think people can mess up a little bit. It's also true when both A and B are true. If you have both of them being true, this whole thing is also true. Because remember, A or B doesn't also mean A or B and not A and B. A and B can be implied by this. Not necessarily, but if A and B are true, then the whole disjunct is still true. Now moving on to the conditional statement. The conditional statement can also cause some confusion because the conditional statement is only false when A is true but B is false. That's the only time this conditional statement will be false. If B is true but A is false, the conditional statement is actually true. That can cause some confusion. But logically speaking, it's true. It can also be true when A is false and B is false. So the time when the conditional statement is, the only time when the conditional statement is false is when you have A and A is true and B is false. That's when the conditional statement is false. The biconditional statement is only false when the truth value of these two do not match. So for instance, if A is true and B is false, then the biconditional statement is false. If A is false and B is true, then the biconditional statement is likewise false. Now if A is false and B is false, then the biconditional statement is actually true. If A is true and B is true, then the biconditional statement is true. So when these truth values match, be them false or be they true, that is when the biconditional statement is going to be true. But if they don't match, then the biconditional statement is false. And only there is it false. So these are the basic symbols. Again, remember you have that symbolic logic key that I mailed out to you, and you can use that in order to reference when we translate some of these sentences here. So using those symbols, let's try and translate the following statements. So just as an example, you break it down into its parts as best you can. So you take cats, you can symbolize it with a C. You take dogs, you can symbolize it with a D. You take the conjunction and you symbolize it with the ampersand, right? And then you have your symbolic logic statement right there. That's how you might translate that. So take a moment, pause the video, I'd recommend. Take a moment and look at each of these statements and see if you can give a translation into symbolic logic of these following sentences. And when you unpause the video, I'm going to post right here the answers to each one of these. So take a moment and see if you can translate them. So hopefully you have translated all of these, and let us see what the answers are. So as we discussed, C or D, another pretty self-explanatory one would be C or D, CVD. Now we start to get a little bit more complicated as we get longer sentences, of course. So you have the subject and you have the predicate, or the action of the subject. And in this case, you can translate the I as I, easy enough, and then the going to the store as S. But what is the relationship between the going to the store and the I? It's basically a conditional statement. If you have I, then you have going to the store. And in this case, you might also add underneath a separate premise that you do have the I. That's probably implied by it. But this is a basic way of how you would translate this statement. I, then S. Now let's look at these next two. These are kind of interesting as we discuss the singular and biconditional statements. So I am Ben. It's also true when I'm saying this, when I'm using this word am, I mean it in a fuller sense. I don't just mean that this subject partakes in benness, but also this benness partakes in the I. It's a both-way conditional. If you have Ben, then you have I. If you have I, then you have Ben. So I mean this biconditionally. But for instance, when I'm talking about I am human, I only mean it in a one-way conditional. I am human, but I don't mean that when you have a human, you always have I. So in that sense, the conditional statement is one way. So biconditional and singular conditional. Biconditional represented by that triple bar equal sign, and this for the single conditional, the directional pointer. Now this last one I thought would be an interesting one to reinforce what we mean by or and the ambiguity of it. So you might translate this as I am going to school or calling out sick. So I am calling out sick or I'm going to school. You translate it like this. But in context, knowing what these mean, taking them out of their purely formal symbolic representations, we know the meaning of these things thus that we think that when somebody's saying this, they mean something mutually exclusive. In which case, you wouldn't just say S or C, but also and not both of them. So not applied to the conjunction of going to school and calling out sick. That's how you would symbolize that, or at least one way in which you can symbolize it. You'll find that in translating these things, there are obviously equivalencies. And we'll get into that when we do the proving of validity. You can prove logical equivalencies of other symbolic forms that will mean the same exact thing. Let's look at a few arguments, some really basic arguments. So this is what you would call a hypothetical syllogism. It's just a formal name for it, and we'll talk about it when we get to logical inferences. Fido is a dog, and dogs are mammals. So remember, try to break it down into its parts as best you can and symbolize it. You see the conjunction here, purely linguistic thing that we use is rather than are. But the symbolic form will be the same. It's just a grammatical rule. So, if you have Fido, then you have a dog. If you have a dog, then you have a mammal. Therefore, if you have Fido, then you have a mammal. There's a way that we would symbolize the hypothetical syllogism there. So, it is raining or I am outside. Break it down into its parts. Take it is raining or I'm outside with this as the logical conjunction. Now, I am not outside. So this is a qualification to this entire statement. And you can translate this as the following. So it's raining outside, or it's raining, or I'm outside. You can also translate it as this. This is, I believe, called material implication, and it means the same thing logically. Either way, however you translate the two things, this is still going to be the same valid argument. And you take the not O and you use it as a disjunct, what's called a disjunctive syllogism. Again, these words aren't too important right now. But you use that not O, and when you have one of these not being true, since the premise is assumed to be true, if one of them's not true, and we said that a disjunct, at least one of them has to be true, then that means we definitely have R. So if not O, then we have R. Likewise, you can use it right here in the hypothetical syllogism. Hypothetical syllogism doesn't suppose that it's not raining or that you're not outside, but with this additional premise, you do have it. And so you can get R. And then we get R. That's one way to symbolize these things. What we do now is open up that worksheet I sent you. I gave you two worksheets. One's worksheet number 1 and one's worksheet number 2. Take worksheet number 1 and see if you can do the translations in that worksheet. So pause the video, take as much time as you need, go back in the video if you want, familiarize yourself and, keep it in front of you, the reference sheet of symbolic logic, and try to translate those sentences. If you have any questions on it, if you have any questions on the worksheet, just email me and I can try and get back to you. If you really want, I can also probably grade your papers as I have a little bit more time with this whole quarantine thing going on. So you could send those to me if you feel like it. And again, any questions you have, just send me something in an email, or you can comment below too on this video. So take a moment, pause this, and start it back up when you are done. Okay, so hopefully you completed those exercises. So we dealt with translating into logic, so now let's look in how we turn arguments into equations to prove them. So we already saw how we turn them into a symbolic logic form, but how are we going to, particularly when they get more complicated? So let's go back and look at what we mean by argument. So we discussed this earlier in one of the introduction classes and perhaps in some other classes as well. But remember, the definition of an argument is premises, or even a premise technically, with a conclusion. Now there are types of arguments. There are valid arguments, there are invalid arguments, and there are sound arguments. Important basic language of logic when dealing with arguments. So let's look at what each one of these means. A valid argument means that the conclusion is logically contained in the combination of premises. When you have a valid argument, you have a conclusion that's logically contained in the combination of premises. This doesn't mean that the conclusion is true and the premises are true. It simply means that if those premises are true, that conclusion follows as a matter of logic, because within those premises is logically contained the conclusion. In the combination of those premises, the conclusion is logically contained in it. In other words, if you presume those premises, logic dictates that that conclusion has to be true. An invalid argument is the opposite. The conclusion is not logically contained in the combination of premises. In other words, you have statements, potentially all of them are true too. In fact, the reverse of this could be the case in a valid argument, right? So a conclusion could be true and all the premises could be true, but the argument could still be invalid because the conclusion wasn't actually contained in those premises. Soundness is the perfection of arguments. Soundness is when the argument is valid, that is, the conclusion is contained in the premises, and all the premises are true. Another way to put this is that the argument's conclusion is led to by the premises, and each of those premises are true. This also means the conclusion will be true, because if those premises are true and it's valid, logically it dictates that the conclusion will be true as well. So what we're going to aim at, obviously, is to get rid of invalid arguments, to only use valid arguments, and to be able to see when we have each of those two things. Using soundness is further argumentation would be required to prove the truth of each of those premises. You could go on a long time with this, but the point of the matter is we're ultimately trying to get to sound arguments and learning how to avoid invalid arguments and to find valid arguments. So proving validity. There's two ways I could think of off the top of my head of how we prove validity. One is with truth tables, which we aren't going to really cover today. And without a computer program, this can take an excruciating long period of time, particularly when you have a complicated argument. The easier and faster way of proving validity is inference and equivalency. Now, if something seems fishy about an argument to you, you might want to use the tools of proving invalidity. Now, you can easily, or you can accurately do that with a truth table, but it can take a real long time. But there's something else called substitution, and I'll briefly mention it at the end of this. We aren't really going to do proof of invalidity in this class today, but I'll at least give you the method of how you can show shorthand something is invalid. And it's faster than perhaps all these methods together, when you can identify it, I suppose. At any rate, proving validity. So let's look at inference and equivalency. This is going to take up the bulk of a lot of symbolic logic classes, and you're constantly going to use the rules of inference and equivalency in order to prove validity. So let's look at each one of those rules. The rules of inference. These are a list. They're typically used by this name and often by these abbreviations when you see them in symbolic logic textbooks. Let's go through each one of these. And most of these are going to seem pretty obvious because they're simply inferences of logic. Your own mind will be able to judge correctly just by looking at them that they're true. Sometimes you need to break it down a little bit in order to see that truth, but your mind will be able to be a sufficient judge unto itself. You aren't going to have to go out in the world to demonstrate its truth. So simplification. Simplification simply means that whenever you have a conjunction of things, one of those two things, since both of them are true, can be taken as granted by itself. So if you have A and B, then you definitely have B. If you have A and B, you definitely also have A. You can also do A by simplification. So simplification is just that rule in which we can break down a conjunction into each of its parts, because when you have a conjunction, you do have both of those parts. Now, obviously, when you have a disjunction, you don't necessarily have both of those parts. You may, but you may not. Now, addition, and this is a rule that's kind of interesting because this can trip people up, particularly when they look at contradictions, which we'll cover in a little bit later here in this class. But A, if you have a given A, if you have some variable, A, B, C, D, whatever, if you have a variable, you can add anything to it by a disjunction. You can say whatever thing that's true, and this is where some of these expressions come from in logic. You can say either the sky is blue or pigs can fly. It's a perfectly true statement. Even though we all know pigs can't fly, you can add that statement to it because remember, a disjunct is true when at least one of the statements are true. Doesn't matter if the other statement's false. So it's a true statement to say that the sky is blue or pigs fly. That's a true statement, logically true, because at least one side of the disjunct is true. So addition is a logical rule, meaning that we can add anything by a disjunct to any given variable. It doesn't mean it's true. It's not like you're adding some truth to reality. That's the whole point of the matter. Because the disjunct only means that one is necessarily true. Both could be, but not necessarily. It doesn't have to be. A conjunction is kind of the opposite of simplification, right? Or it's kind of the reverse of simplification. So when you have separate parts, you can always add separate parts together. Now think of an argument. Take an argument that we had, A then B. Oh, sorry about this bad writing. B then C. You can take those premises, because you have both of them there, and you can use conjunction to get A then B. Make sure to bracket them so you know what they're referring to there. And B then C. That would be conjunction. You're taking two separate parts and adding them together. A simple form of that, you're given A, you're given B, therefore A then B by conjunction. A disjunctive syllogism is a very common syllogism. So remember, A or B means at least one of those two are true, because the statement would be false otherwise. So if you have not A, then you definitely have B. If you had not B, then you would definitely have A. That is called a disjunctive syllogism. So remember, it's raining outside or I am outside. If I'm not outside, therefore it's raining. That would be a use of the disjunctive syllogism. Modus ponens, the way of positing. It is simply a conditional statement when you're given the antecedent, when you're given the first part of the conditional statement. So if you have A then B, and you're given A, it means B follows. That's called modus ponens. Modus tollens has to do with the opposite side, the B. Postcedent? I don't know the right word. Anyway, A then B. So if you're given not B, it means not A. Because remember, a conditional statement, the only time it's false is when you have not B, but you also have A. So when you have not B, you know not A has to follow. That's called modus tollens. Hypothetical syllogism, another very common form of argumentation. If A, then B. If B, then C. That means it's kind of like following a path, right? If you have A, then you're going to have C. That's called hypothetical syllogism. You can derive if A, then C by hypothetical syllogism. Constructive dilemma is another basic one, but a longer one. When you have two hypothetical statements and you're given A or C, you're given the antecedents in a disjunction, you know that you're either going to have B or D, because one of these two, at least one of these two, if not both, is true. And if one of those two is true, then you're either going to have B, or you're going to have D, or you're going to have both. And thus you conclude B or D. This is by constructive dilemma. Basically, the word comes from, you have the construct there and you have the dilemma. You have the conjunction and the dilemma. Or you can construct this, I guess perhaps better, you can construct this dilemma from these two things. Absorption. Absorption is a pretty basic rule that I don't think you're going to use too often. But if you're given A then B, then obviously A then B is going to also be A then A and B. Because if you have this conditional statement and it follows through, then you're still going to have A when you already posited it over here. That is basic logic right there. And I don't think you'll use this rule. I don't know if I've ever used this rule before, but just know that it's there. That's called absorption. So an important thing to know about inferences is you have to have the thing broken down. So this is false right here. You cannot derive B by simplification from this. You can derive A and B by simplification. No, you can't even do that because it's a disjunct there, sorry. So you cannot derive B from this conjunction right there because it's not simplified. It's within a disjunct. It has to be simplified in order to derive something from it. And this applies to all of those rules of inference. You have to have the thing broken down. You can't take a little part of a sentence and use it in an inference. So this right here is definitely false. You can't derive B by simplification. So let's look where we can. If you had it simplified to where you just had those things standing on their own, then you could derive B by simplification. This is right. You'd also derive A by simplification of this. So no, again, these rules of inference, as opposed to the rules of equivalency, which you're about to see, these rules of inference can only be used with those simple forms, right? There has to be those simple forms. And when I mean simple forms, don't hear what I'm not saying. So this would also be a simple form right here, right? This would be a simple form. So you have the conjunct and you have both its parts. In other words, you have this form present right here. But if I added something more, if I added like a disjunct here, or I added a conditional statement there, then it breaks its simplicity. You no longer have the form A and B there. So you have to have the simple form in order to use inferences. And if you don't, then you cannot use the inference until you have already broken it down into the simple form. With equivalency, though, this isn't the case. With equivalency, you can take this and you can turn it into this, because you can use the double negation. This is a rule of equivalency we'll look at. You can use that double negation by itself, even though it's already within a more complicated form. So equivalency allows you to go into a long statement and target the particular things. So this would work. That would work. So let's look at the rules of equivalency. One of the most basic ones is tautology. Now remember what we said about equivalency, it can be used in the complicated form. This also means you can go back and forth, unlike inferences. Inferences are like a single conditional. Equivalencies are basically biconditional. So you can go from A or A and get A, and you can also go from A and get A or A. Likewise, you can go from A and get A, or A and get A and A. They mean the same thing logically. Logically, those things mean the same thing. Same thing with double negation. So you could add the tildes to this. You could go from A and get to not A, or you could go from not A and get to A. So we can derive A or not A by double negation. De Morgan's theorem is basically this and this. If you have not A and B, that's the same thing as saying not A or not B. When you have not A or B, it's the same thing as saying not A and not B. And you can go back and forth with them, right? Remember, you can go back, you can take it in both directions, unlike inferences. So we can translate not A or B as not A and not B by De Morgan's theorem. That's how you make that translation there. Association is where you have A or B or C, and you can move the parentheses there because it means the same thing. But remember, each of these conjuncts or each of these connectors have to be the same type of connector. It has to be the or statements, right? Or the conjunctive statements. So if this were not an ampersand, but a V, you could not use association there. But if they're both the same, then you can move the parentheses over. And what's useful about that is if you move the parentheses over, then you could take this and then simplify A to keep A on its own, or B and C on its own if you need it for one of your proofs. This is called association. And remember, it goes both ways. You can take it both ways, as with all equivalencies. Transposition is reversing the side of a single conditional and making both of them negated. So you can take A then B and turn it into not B then not A. And just remember, when is a conditional statement false, and that can help you understand the rules of why this is a logically valid maneuver. Again, remember, like all equivalencies and unlike inferences, you can take it both directions. You can turn not B then not A into A then B. Distribution. Distribution is when you have the disjunct or conjunction, but you have a different one on the other side. This is the type of change you can make, unlike the association, unlike the associative rule. So A and B or C, you can translate into A and B or A and C by distribution. Basically, you're distributing this A into the conditional statement, and you're logically able to do so. And also, if it's a disjunct outside and a conjunction in the parentheses, this is how you could translate it. And remember, you can go back and forth between those. So you can take that longer one and reduce it to that more simple one. Material implication is what we did on that translation, the translation with raining outside or I'm outside, right? This is material implication. When you have this statement, then you can translate it into this, and vice versa. So that is material implication. Again, remember, both ways. Get tired of me saying that for each one of these. For equivalencies, but not for inferences, you can take them both directions. Exportation, I don't see this one used too much, but exportation, you can take this statement, it's a conditional statement. So when you're looking at all these kind of longer statements like this, look to these 3 rules, right? This one deals with conditional statements with a conjunct in the parentheses. This statement is equivalent to this. You can translate A and B, then C, to A, then B, then C, and vice versa. You can translate it back. Commutative. This is when you take A or B and you just switch the sides on which that statement is on. Likewise, same thing with this. A or B means the exact same thing as B or A. Same thing as A and B means the exact same thing as B and A. And you can take it both directions. Oops. Finally, there's material equivalency, but I have clicked on there, but you can take a look at that one as well. So let's look at an example. An example number 1, we have this statement right here of A then B, not B and G, and we can derive not A from this. And the way we derived it is this. This is how we're proving the validity of this conclusion. So we can derive not B from simplifying number 2. We simplified number 2, and we got not B. And we can conclude, therefore, from this, not A, by combining premise 1 and premise 1A through modus tollens, or the negation of one of the latter side of the conditional, we can know, therefore, not A. So this is the way you want to list validity or prove validity from inferences and equivalencies. You can see right here we just use inferences. These are both rules of inference. So let us look at another example without me giving you the explanation. A or B B or C, A or D, and not D. Therefore, C. Now take a moment, pause the video, and see if you can fill in right here and right here to show why this is a valid argument. So take a moment, pause this video, and come back and we'll go through it. So hopefully you've come up with a solution for this, or a proof of its validity. And there's actually more than one way to prove validity most times, but you'll probably come up with something like this. So we can derive A then C by hypothetical syllogism of 1 and 2. See, hypothetical syllogism of 1 and 2. Through the use of that rule of inference, we can deduce A then C. Now that we have A then C, we can derive A from 3 and 4. And either of these two steps can come first since they don't rely on the previous step there, right? So deductive syllogism of 3 and 4 gives us A. Because remember, A or D, if one of them is false, then the other one has to be true for that premise to be true. So we can derive A from 3 and 4. Now through the rule of inference of modus ponens, we can take 1A and 2A and derive C. You posit A, now that you have A, you can plug it in there and you can get C. And a fun thing to do too would be to take this argument and fill in the variables. You can see a valid argument. You can construct a valid argument. And you can see how much easier it flows when you plug in the meanings to those symbols. Look at one more example. This one is J and not H or P. Not P, then not J. As I say, filling in a meaning for these statements, you can think something is just and it's not harming or punishing. Or if something's not punishing, then it's not just. Now we can derive this conclusion from it, which is interesting because do you see any of those variables there? This is something I spoke about earlier that I wanted to demonstrate about the rule of addition. So know that the rule of addition will be used here. So take a moment, pause this, and see if you can come to this conclusion. So hopefully you have come to this conclusion, and let's see how we can get there. We can simplify number 1 to not H or P. Using De Morgan's theorem, which is a rule of equivalency rather than inference, we can take that and translate it. We can take 1A and translate it into this. Not H and not P. Through which, by simplification of this, you can get not P. Using modus ponens, we can now derive not J from 3A and 2. From 3A and 2. We plug in the not P, and we get a not J. But we can also get J by simplifying number 1. And if we can get J, then by addition, we can add anything we want. So here's where you might plug in, find that conclusion you want, and plug that in there. And then you can derive this conclusion by combining 6A with 4A, because if one of the two statements of the disjunct is false, the other has to be true. Now, what absurdity happened here? Because if this is the case, we can prove anything with addition. So the trick here, and the thing that happened with this with these two premises, is there's a contradiction contained in the premises. There's a contradiction contained in there. This would be a proof, what we might call a reductio. It's a complicated form of reductio ad absurdum. We take the premises and we prove there's an absurdity. We can make this some crazy statement to show that this argument proves some absurdity. The point is, and here's the kicker right here. Take those two, you can combine it together by disjunction, and you have not J and J, which is a contradiction. Remember we said perhaps J stands for justice. Something is not just and just. That's a contradiction of terms. That's illogical. But from a contradiction, through the use of addition, we can prove anything. Anything. And there's nothing else that we can use to prove anything except a contradiction. And thus we can prove an absurdity, and thus prove that something went wrong with these premises in truth. And this is how you can get to soundness of premises, right? Through reductio ad absurdums. So it's an interesting trick right here. It's an interesting tool that you can use in sophistry too. Not that I'm advocating such evil use of philosophy. But there's a dialogue, and unfortunately I forgot it off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up. But there's a Platonic dialogue, a very fun Platonic dialogue, where these two guys come back. They're very pugnacious. They're very kind of combative guys, have a lot of fun. And they come to Socrates and start arguing with him and prove everybody anything that they want to prove to them by basically using this trick. They get the person to admit some contradiction, and through the contradiction, they get the person to prove anything that they want to that person. And half the time the person is confused and thinks that, well, that must follow, not realizing that a contradiction was made in the first place. So that's an interesting issue when you come with a contradiction. When you have a contradiction, you can prove anything. But also, when you can prove anything, you can know, therefore, that something went wrong with the premises, that there's an unsound premise. There's a premise that's false. With proving the validity, I have a longer worksheet for you, worksheet number 2, and if you wish, pause the video now and try and complete it. But note that some of the questions can have more than one right answer. I'm thinking particularly with that first column. You'll see what's the quick inference that you would want to make, but if you think about those rules thoroughly, you can see you can add a whole lot of answers in the fill in the blank things. Now, like with the first worksheet, if you want, you can send it to me and I'll look over it and see if it went right, if it went wrong, and offer additional commentary. And you can say something in the comments below if you want to. So pause the video right now and try and complete that worksheet. So hopefully we're successful with that exercise. So this pretty much concludes this class, but I want to look at a few other things just briefly, just to give you a taste of further things in logic. And there's much more than this. Like there's something called existential quantifiers. You can also start dealing with modal logic and other various things that you can use as shortcuts for symbolizing to make your symbolization far more simple when you're dealing with existential questions or modal questions. Now, proving invalidity. We didn't really discuss proving invalidity, but there are at least 3 ways to do it. There's truth tables, which again, these are truth tables right here. When you have a very complex statement or a very complex argument, truth tables can get inordinately long to complete. And a computer program, however, could be something that you could use to easily plug in those things and get your answers there. Much like a calculator for logic, you could say. Substitution, however, is going to be one of the more useful methods for proving invalidity. And this is how you do it. You basically take the form, so the raw symbolic form. So if something's like A or C and D, you take that pure symbol, the form there, and you replace it with some other statement that you know would be true to keep this same form true. And you take the premises 1 and 2, and you make sure that you plug into those premises so that the premises are actually true. And when you plug them in and you find that the conclusion is false, it means that the argument is invalid. Because a valid argument, the conclusion is always true by that form. The form is perfect no matter what you place in the variables. So if you can place something in those variables and get a false conclusion, then it means the whole form of the argument is bad. It's an invalid argument. Another way, and it's a little bit more complicated, and if any of you want further information on this, I can give you a website I thought was really good on logic that deals with shortcut truth tables. This is basically, you can make logical rules of inferences and reduce the number of truth tables you need to make because of implications of certain premises. And you can greatly reduce your time with a truth table, because a truth table is kind of the mathematical way of proving invalidity, and it can take forever. Substitution is a shortcut, and this type of shortcut right here just lets you still use the clear and concise mathematical method or logical method to prove invalidity. Another thing you might look at is variables. This is when we don't just deal with a single variable symbol, but we take a variable it modifies. So it's like cx and tx as written up there, right? So x is a singular thing that is tan and is a cat. And you use that variable across things. This makes defining is statements a lot easier, or translating is statements a lot easier, because that existential connection between the variable and its predicate is a little bit made a little bit more vague when you just take a symbol like that rather than apply it to a singular variable. You can do things more precise, I think, with variables as well. So I highly recommend starting to get into that if you want to take your logic further. Truth tables, we basically kind of discussed truth tables when we were talking about the symbolic key, right? So remember, when is an or statement false? It's only false when both of the statements are false. Otherwise, it's true. And when is a conditional statement false? Only when the antecedent is true and the latter is false. So that's basically what a truth table is. It lists all those out, and then you can combine them with other truth tables to determine validity. And it's a further class, perhaps, if you all want to look at that later. If not, you can look it up online. I can give you some resources to find that as well. So I hope you found this class on symbolic logic useful, or at least perhaps have a better grasp of what's underlying all of real philosophy, the logic which philosophy uses to approach any particular subject matter, and how all the sciences and all ordered thinking is fundamentally contingent on all of this stuff being true. So I hope that's useful. I hope you all have a good time as best as you can with all the stuff going on right now with the coronavirus. And again, know that you're in our prayers, and we offer Mass daily for you all, even if you all can't be here. So take care.